I am fairly tied to the chariot wheels of history now, my dear children, and must follow on with name and place and date, whether my tale suffer by it or no. With such a drama as this afoot it were impertinent to speak of myself, save in so far as I saw or heard what may make these old scenes more vivid to you. It is no pleasant matter for me to dwell upon, yet, convinced as I am that there is no such thing as chance either in the great or the little things of this world, I am very sure that the sacrifices of these brave men were not thrown away, and that their strivings were not as profitless as might at first sight appear. If the perfidious race of Stuart is not now seated upon the throne, and if religion in England is still a thing of free growth, we may, to my thinking, thank these Somerset yokels for it, who first showed how small a thing would shake the throne of an unpopular monarch. Monmouth's army was but the vanguard of that which marched 3 years later into London, when James and his cruel ministers were flying as outcasts over the face of the earth. On the night of June 27th, or rather early in the morning of June 28th, we reached the town of Frome, very wet and miserable, for the rain had come on again, and all the roads were quagmires. From this next day we pushed on once more to Wells, where we spent the night and the whole of the next day, to give the men time to get their clothes dry, and to recover themselves after their privations. In the forenoon a parade of our Wiltshire regiment was held in the Cathedral Close, when Monmouth praised it, as it well deserved, for the soldierly progress made in so short a time. As we returned to our quarters after dismissing our men, we came upon a great throng of the rough Bagworthy and miners, who were assembled in the open space in front of the cathedral, listening to one of their own number, who was addressing them from a cart. The wild and frenzied gestures of the man showed us that he was one of those extreme sectaries whose religion runs perilously near to madness. The hums and groans which rose from the crowd proved, however, that his fiery words were well suited to his hearers, so we halted on the verge of the multitude and hearkened to his address. A red-bearded, fierce-faced man he was, with tangled shaggy hair tumbling over his gleaming eyes, and a hoarse voice which resounded over the whole square. "What shall we not do for the Lord?" he cried. "What shall we not do for the Holy of Holies? Why is it that his hand is heavy upon us? Why is it that we have not freed this land, even as Judith freed Bethulia? Behold, we have looked for peace but no good came, and for a time of health, and behold trouble. Why is this, I say? Truly, brothers, it is because we have slighted the Lord, because we have not been wholehearted towards him. Lo! We have praised him with our breath, but in our deeds we have been cold towards him. Ye know well that prelacy is an accursed thing, a hissing and an abomination in the eyes of the Almighty. Yet what have we, his servants, wrought for him in this matter? Have we not seen prelatist churches, churches of form and of show, where the creature is confounded with the Creator? Have we not seen them, I say, and have we not forborne to sweep them away, and so lent our sanction to them? There is the sin of a lukewarm and backsliding generation. There is the cause why the Lord should look coldly upon his people. Lo! At Shepton and at Frome we have left such churches behind us. At Glastonbury, too, we have spared those wicked walls which were reared by idolatrous hands of old. Woe unto ye, if, after having put your hands to God's plough, ye turn back from the work. See there, he howled, facing round to the beautiful cathedral, what means this great heap of stones? Is it not an altar of Baal? Is it not built for man-worship rather than God-worship? Is it not there that the man can, tricked out in his foolish rotchet and baubles, may preach his soulless and lying doctrines, which are but the old dish of popery served up under a new cover? And shall we suffer this thing? Shall we, the chosen children of the Great One, allow this plague spot to remain? Can we expect the Almighty to help us when we will not stretch out a hand to help him? We have left the other temples of prelacy behind us. Shall we leave this one, too, my brothers? No, no, yelled the crowd, tossing and swaying. Shall we pluck it down, then, until no one stone is left upon another? Yes, yes, they shouted. Now, at once? Yes, yes. Then to work, he cried, and springing from the cart he rushed towards the cathedral, with the whole mob of wild fanatics at his heels. Some crowded in, shouting and yelling, through the open doors, while others swarmed up the pillars and pedestals of the front, hacking at the sculptured ornaments, and tugging at the grey old images which filled every niche. "This must be stopped," said Saxon curtly. "We cannot afford to insult and estrade the whole Church of England to please a few hot-headed ranters. The pillage of this cathedral would do our cause more harm than a pitched battle lost. Do you bring up your company, Sir Gervas, and we shall do what we can to hold them in check until they come." "Hi, Masterton," cried the baronet, spying one of his under-officers among the crowd who were looking on, neither assisting nor opposing the rioters. "Do you hasten to the quarters, and tell Barker to bring up the company with their matches burning? I may be of use here." "Ha, here is Bice," cried Saxon joyously, as the huge German ploughed his way through the crowd. "And Lord Grey, too. We must save the cathedral, my lord. They would sack and burn it." "This way, gentlemen," cried an old grey-haired man, running out towards us with hands outspread, and a bunch of keys clanking at his girdle. "Oh, hasten, gentlemen, if ye can indeed prevail over these lawless men. They have pulled down St. Peter, and they will have Paul down too unless help comes. There will not be an apostle left. The east window is broken. They have brought a hogshead of beer, and are broaching it upon the high altar. Oh, alas, alas! That such things should be in a Christian land." He sobbed aloud and stamped about in a very frenzy of grief. "It is the verger, sirs," said one of the townsfolk. "He hath grown grey in the cathedral." "This way to the vestry door, my lords and gentlemen," cried the old man, pushing away strenuously through the crowd. "Now, lackaday, the sainted Paul hath gone too." As he spoke, a splintering crash from inside the cathedral announced some fresh outrage on the part of the zealots. Our guide hastened on with renewed speed, until he came to a low oaken door heavily arched, which he unlocked with much rasping of wards and creaking of hinges. Through this we sidled as best we might, and hurried after the old man down a stone-flagged corridor, which led through a wicket into the cathedral close by the high altar. The great building was full of the rioters, who were rushing hither and thither, destroying and breaking everything which they could lay their hands on. A good number of these were genuine zealots, the followers of the preacher whom we had listened to outside. Others, however, were on the face of them mere rogues and thieves, such as gather round every army upon the march. While the former were tearing down images from the walls, or hurling the books of common prayer through the stained-glass windows, the others were rooting up the massive brass candlesticks, and carrying away everything which promised to be of value. One ragged fellow was in the pulpit, tearing off the crimson velvet and hurling it down among the crowd. Another had upset the reading desk, and was busily engaged in wrenching off the brazen fastenings. In the center of the side aisle a small group had a rope round the neck of Mark the Evangelist, and were dragging lustily upon it, until, even as we entered, the statue, after tottering for a few moments, came crashing down upon the marble floor. The shouts which greeted every fresh outrage, with the splintering of woodwork, the smashing of windows, and the clatter of falling masonry, made up a most deafening uproar, which was increased by the droning of the organ, until some of the rioters silenced it by slitting up the bellows. What more immediately concerned ourselves was the scene which was being enacted just in front of us at the high altar. A barrel of beer had been placed upon it, and a dozen ruffians gathered round it, one of whom with many ribald jests had climbed up, and was engaged in knocking in the top of the cask with a hatchet. As we entered he had just succeeded in broaching it, and the brown mead was foaming over, while the mob with roars of laughter were passing up their dippers and pannikins. The German soldier rapped out a rough jagged oath at this spectacle, and shouldering his way through the roisterers he sprang upon the altar. The ringleader was bending over his cask, blackjack in hand, when the soldier's iron grip fell upon his collar, and in a moment his heels were flapping in the air, and his head 3 feet deep in the cask, while the beer splashed and foamed in every direction. With a mighty heave, Bice picked up the barrel with the half-drowned miner inside, and hurled it clattering down the broad marble steps which led from the body of the church. At the same time, with the aid of a dozen of our men who had followed us into the cathedral, we drove back the fellows' comrades, and thrust them out beyond the rails which divided the choir from the nave. Our inroad had the effect of checking the riot, but it simply did so by turning the fury of the zealots from the walls and windows to ourselves. Images, stonework, and wood carvings were all abandoned, and the whole swarm came rushing up with a hoarse buzz of rage, all discipline and order completely lost in their religious frenzy. "Smite the prelatists," they howled. "Down with the friends of Antichrist. Cut them off even at the horns of the altar. Down with them." On either side they massed, a wild, half-demented crowd, some with arms and some without, but filled to a man with the very spirit of murder. "This is a civil war within a civil war," said Lord Grey, with a quiet smile. "We had best draw, gentlemen, and defend the gap in the rails, if we may hold it good until help arrives." He flashed out his rapier as he spoke, and took his stand on the top of the steps, with Saxon and Sir Gervas upon one side of him, Bice, Reuben, and myself upon the other. There was only room for 6 to wield their weapons with effect, so our scanty band of followers scattered themselves along the line of the rails, which were luckily so high and strong as to make an escalado difficult in the face of any opposition. The riot had now changed into open mutiny among these marshmen and miners. Pikes, scythes, and knives glimmered through the dim light, while their wild cries re-echoed from the high arched roof like the howling of a pack of wolves. "Go forward, my brothers," cried the fanatic preacher, who had been the cause of the outbreak, "go forward against them. What though they be in high places? There is one who is higher than they. Shall we shrink from his work because of a naked sword? Shall we suffer the prelatist altar to be preserved by these sons of Amalek? On, on! In the name of the Lord!" "In the name of the Lord," cried the crowd, with a sort of hissing gasp, like one who was about to plunge into an icy bath. "In the name of the Lord!" From either side they came on, gathering speed and volume, until at last with a wild cry they surged right down upon our sword points. I can say nothing of what took place to right or left of me during the ruffle, for indeed there were so many pressing upon us, and the fight was so hot, that it was all that each of us could do to hold our own. The very number of our assailants was in our favor, by hampering their sword arms. One burly miner cut fiercely at me with his scythe, but missing me he swung half round with the force of the blow, and I passed my sword through his body before he could recover himself. It was the first time that I had ever slain a man in anger, my dear children, and I shall never forget his white startled face as he looked over his shoulder at me ere he fell. Another closed in with me before I could get my weapon disengaged, but I struck him out with my left hand, and then brought the flat of my sword upon his head, laying him senseless upon the pavement. God knows, I did not wish to take the lives of the misguided and ignorant zealots, but our own were at stake. A marshman, looking more like a shaggy wild beast than a human being, darted under my weapon and caught me round the knees, while another brought a flail down upon my headpiece, from which it glanced on to my shoulder. A third thrust at me with a pike, and pricked me on the thigh, but I shore his weapon in two with one blow, and split his head with the next. The man with the flail gave back at sight of this, and a kick freed me from the unarmed ape-like creature at my feet, so that I found myself clear of my assailants, and none the worse for my encounter, save for a touch on the leg and some stiffness of the neck and shoulder. Looking round I found that my comrades had also beaten off those who were opposed to them. Saxon was holding his bloody rapier in his left hand, while the blood was trickling from a slight wound upon his right. Two miners lay across each other in front of him, but at the feet of Sir Gervas Jerome no fewer than 4 bodies were piled together. He had plucked out his snuff-box as I glanced at him, and was offering it with a bow and a flourish to Lord Grey, as unconcernedly as though he were back once more in his London coffee-house. Bice leaned upon his long broadsword, and looked gloomily at a headless trunk in front of him, which I recognized from the dress as being that of the preacher. As to Reuben, he was unhurt himself, but in sore distress over my own trifling scar, though I assured the faithful lad that it was a less thing than many a tear from branch or thorn which we had had when blackberrying together. The fanatics, though driven back, were not men to be content with a single repulse. They had lost 10 of their number, including their leader, without being able to break our line, but the failure only served to increase their fury. For a minute or so they gathered panting in the aisle. Then with a mad yell they dashed in once more, and made a desperate effort to cut a way through to the altar. It was a fiercer and more prolonged struggle than before. One of our followers was stabbed to the heart over the rails, and fell without a groan. Another was stunned by a mass of masonry hurled at him by a giant cragsman. Reuben was felled by a club, and would have been dragged out and hacked to pieces had I not stood over him and beaten off his assailants. Sir Gervas was borne off his legs by the rush, but lay like a wounded wildcat, striking out furiously at everything which came within his reach. Buyse and Saxon, back to back, stood firm amidst the seething, rushing crowd, cutting down every man within sweep of their swords. Yet in such a struggle numbers must in the end prevail, and I confess that I for one had begun to have fears for the upshot of our contest, when the heavy tramp of disciplined feet rang through the cathedral, and the baronet's musketeers came at a quick run up the central aisle. The fanatics did not await their charge, but darted off over benches and pews, followed by our allies, who were furious on seeing their beloved captain upon the ground. There was a wild minute or two, with confused shuffling of feet, stabs, groans, and the clatter of musket butts on the marble floor. Of the rioters some were slain, but the greater part threw down their arms and were arrested at the command of Lord Grey, while a strong guard was placed at the gates to prevent any fresh outburst of sectarian fury. When at last the cathedral was cleared and order restored, we had time to look around us and to reckon our own injuries. In all my wanderings, and the many wars in which I afterwards fought, wars compared to which this affair of Monmouth's was but the merest skirmish, I have never seen a stranger or more impressive scene. In the dim, solemn light the pile of bodies in front of the rails, with their twisted limbs and white-set faces, had a most sad and ghost-like aspect. The evening light, shining through one of the few unbroken stained-glass windows, cast great splotches of vivid crimson and of sickly green upon the heap of motionless figures. A few wounded men sat about in the front pews or lay upon the steps moaning for water. Of our own small company not one had escaped unscathed. 3 of our followers had been slain outright, while a 4th was lying stunned from a blow. Buyse and Sir Gervas were much bruised. Saxon was cut on the right arm. Reuben had been felled by a bludgeon stroke, and would certainly have been slain but for the fine temper of Sir Jacob Clancing's breastplate, which had turned a fierce pike thrust. As to myself, it is scarce worth the mention, but my head sang for some hours like a good wife's kettle, and my boot was full of blood, which may have been a blessing in disguise, for Snexon, our Havant barber, was ever dinning into my ears how much the better I should be for a phlebotomy. In the meantime all the troops had assembled and the mutiny been swiftly stamped out. There were doubtless many among the Puritans who had no love for the Prelatists, but none save the most crack-brained fanatics could fail to see that the sacking of the cathedral would set the whole Church of England in arms, and ruin the cause for which they were fighting. As it was, much damage had been done, for whilst the gang within had been smashing all which they could lay their hands upon, others outside had chipped off cornices and gargoyles, and had even dragged the lead covering from the roof and hurled it down in great sheets to their companions beneath. This last led to some profit, for the army had no great store of ammunition, so the lead was gathered up by Monmouth's orders and recast into bullets. The prisoners were held in custody for a time, but it was deemed unwise to punish them, so that they were finally pardoned and dismissed from the army. A parade of our whole force was held in the fields outside the town upon the second day of our stay at Wells, the weather having at last become warm and sunny. The foot was then found to muster 6 regiments of 900 men, or 5,400 in all. Of these 1,500 were musketeers, 2,000 were pikemen, and the rest were sidesmen or peasants with flails and hammers. A few bodies, such as our own or those from Taunton, might fairly lay claim to be soldiers, but the most of them were still laborers and craftsmen with weapons in their hands. Yet, ill-armed and ill-drilled as they were, they were still strong, robust Englishmen, full of native courage and of religious zeal. The light and fickle Monmouth began to take heart once more at the sight of their sturdy bearing, and at the sound of their hearty cheers. I heard him as I sat my horse beside his staff speak exultantly to those around him, and ask whether these fine fellows could possibly be beaten by mercenary half-hearted hirelings. "What say you, Wade?" he cried. "Are we never to see a smile on that sad face of yours? Do you not see a woolsack in store for you as you look upon these brave fellows?" "God forbid that I should say a word to damp your Majesty's ardor," the lawyer answered, "yet I cannot but remember that there was a time when your Majesty, at the head of these same hirelings, did drive men as brave as these in headlong rout from Bothwell Bridge." "True, true," said the king, passing his hand over his forehead, a favorite motion when he was worried and annoyed. "They were bold men, the Western Covenanters, yet they could not stand against the rush of our battalions. But they had had no training, whereas these can fight in line and fire a platoon as well as one would wish to see." "If we hadna a gun nor a patronal among us," said Ferguson, "if we hadna sae muckle as a sword, but just to rine Hans, yet would the Lord gie us the victory, if it seemed good in his seeing een." "All battles are but chance work, your Majesty," remarked Saxon, whose sword arm was bound round with his kerchief. "Some lucky turn, some slip or chance which none can foresee, is ever likely to turn the scale. I have lost when I have looked to win, and I have won when I have looked to lose. It is an uncertain game, and one never knows the finish till the last card is played." "Not till the stakes are drawn," said Bice, in his deep guttural voice. "There is many a leader that wins what you call the trick, and yet loses the game." "The trick being the battle and the game the campaign," quoth the king, with a smile. "Our German friend is a master of campfire metaphors. But methinks our poor horses are in a sorry state. What would Cousin William over at The Hague, with his spruce guards, think of such a show as this?" During this talk the long column of foot had tramped past, still bearing the banners which they had brought with them to the wars, though much the worse for wind and weather. Monmouth's remarks had been drawn forth by the aspect of the 10 troops of horse which followed. The chargers had been sadly worn by the continued work and constant rain, while the riders, having allowed their caps and fronts to get coated with rust, appeared to be in as bad a plight as their steeds. It was clear to the least experienced of us that if we were to hold our own it was upon our foot that we must rely. On the tops of the low hills all round the frequent shimmer of arms, glancing here and there when the sun's rays struck upon them, showed how strong our enemies were in the very point in which we were so weak. Yet in the main this Wells review was cheering to us, as showing that the men kept in good heart, and that there was no ill feeling at the rough handling of the zealots upon the day before. The enemy's horse hovered about us during these days, but the foot had been delayed through the heavy weather and the swollen streams. On the last day of June we marched out of Wells, and made our way across flat sedgy plains and over the Lopolden hills to Bridgewater, where we found some few recruits awaiting us. Here Monmouth had some thoughts of making a stand, and even set to work raising earthworks, but it was pointed out to him that, even could he hold the town, there was not more than a few days' provisions within it, while the country round had been already swept so bare that little more could be expected from it. The works were therefore abandoned, and, fairly driven to bay, without a loophole of escape left, we awaited the approach of the enemy.